Hello and welcome to Forbidden History Radio, where we explore humanity's hidden history, out-of-place artifacts, lost civilizations, and startling evidence that the truth is being suppressed.
So again, today we're going to be talking about ancient aliens, and to do that we'll be talking to Giorgio Tsoukalos. And so let me tell you a little bit about Giorgio, and we will get him on the air. Giorgio A. Tsoukalos has been described as a real-life Indiana Jones. As a trailblazer, he is changing the way the world thinks about ancient astronaut theory. For over 10 years, Giorgio has been the director of Erich von Däniken Center for Ancient Astronaut Research, which is AASRA, Archaeology, Astronautics, and SETI Research Association. Ooh, that's a mouthful. He is also the publisher of Legendary Times, the world's only and definitive ancient astronaut research journal. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio from LegendaryTimes.com, Giorgio Tsoukalos. Hey, Giorgio.
How are you, Dr. Rita? I'm really happy to be here. I'm sure we're going to have a great time.
I am just so excited about having you on. When I got notification that Erich von Däniken had a new book out, I was like, woohoo, woohoo, wait, pick me. And just having you on the show just makes my day. I'm just so excited to have you here. So let's start at the beginning. How, you are the director of Erich's organization. I put the paper down, and the print is so small. His Center for Ancient Astronaut Research.
Yeah.
How did you get involved with that and just into the whole ancient astronaut ball game?
Well, I really have to thank my parents for that, because growing up, we traveled the world quite extensively, and so my parents always made sure that whenever we were in different countries, we'd go to the museums and to the archaeological sites and have some, guided tours, this and that. But then, upon our return home, my grandmother would say, look, yes, you've just been to all these places, and you've been told this mainstream idea of this site or that site, but let me introduce you to some alternative history perspectives. And so it was also my grandmother who introduced me to the books of Erich von Däniken and all sorts of other ancient astronaut and alternative history researchers and writers. And so at an early age, the idea that there is an alternative perspective out there on history has been instilled upon me, like I said, at a very, very early age. So this was sort of dinner table conversation, especially when my grandparents would be, coming over for a visit. And so it also didn't hurt that I grew up for part of my life in Switzerland, and Erich von Däniken is Swiss. So as a young teenager, I started to go to some of his lectures, and I became friends with some of Erich's friends. And then one thing led to the other. I became friends with Erich, and then in college, that was in the mid-'90s, Dr. Gene Phillips, the guy who ran the Ancient Astronaut Society, decided to finally retire and just enjoy his life in Florida. So Gene Phillips at that point published this magazine called Ancient Skies, and that had been around since 1974, and that was the English version that he published, and Erich von Däniken, since 1974, published a German version of Ancient Skies. So when Gene Phillips told Erich, I'm going to retire, Erich was like, all right, well, no problem, because I'm going to continue publishing Ancient Skies in German. We have no problem with that, or there won't be much of a difference. But what about the English-speaking world? So Eric essentially gave me a call, asked me if I wanted to, head a new organization under a new banner, Legendary Times, and what was I supposed to say? No? So, of course I said yes, and here we are in our 11th year running Legendary Times, and our first issue had 12 pages, and now, 11 years later, now every issue has at least 64 pages.
Wow.
And
That's some pretty good growth.
Yeah, and we're completely ad-free. So, the magazine is 64 pages of articles from the first to the last page. So it's not, because with a lot of magazines in a similar or in the alternative history field, it's like you're looking at a pictorial for ads. And this is not the case with us. And we also use, we don't use 16-point font. We use small font. So it's really it's jam-packed with information.
So I have to ask this question because, my experience with Eric von Däniken is, through his books and then seeing him on TV. So is he really like that? I think he comes off as being like a really cool and fun guy and somebody that I would love to sit down and drink a beer with. Is he that way in real life?
Yes, he is, absolutely. And he is one of the most, down-to-earth people that you'd ever meet, very generous with his time, very friendly, and, because here's the crazy thing that sets essentially the Legendary Times organization apart and Eric von Däniken apart from a whole bunch of the other people in the UFO field, and that is, at heart, both Eric von Däniken and myself and David Childress and Jason Martell, Zechariah Sitchin, all of my colleagues, we're skeptics at heart because there are certain pieces of evidence that have been put forth that were just plain wrong. And if a piece of evidence turns out to be wrong or is wrong, our organization has no problem in throwing that piece of evidence out because, people say, well, why would you do that? That just diminishes the whole theory. And you, as a educated woman, know that, look, anyone who's educated, or even anyone with a half a brain, knows the more false evidence you eliminate from a theory, the stronger the theory gets, because whatever pieces of evidence are left over, gosh, that means your theory has just gotten stronger because you're eliminating the wrong stuff. And that's what we're doing. And whatever, has remained makes the ancient astronaut theory even more, Teflon, like Teflon.
Well, and I think it's interesting because I think that there's a lot of evidence, and even from a conceptual point of view, back in the 70s, reading Chariots of the Gods, I mean, it totally made sense to me. There's what the academicians say, but then there's, what your head and your heart say that made sense. And I don't understand with the amount of evidence and proof that has been coming forward over the years why mainstream archaeology, I guess that would be the field, still has such heartburn with it.
Well, because, the chronologies that they've established in their textbooks and in their museums and things like that. Look, the archaeologists are doing wonderful, wonderful work. They're a great bunch of people who take it upon themselves to spend hours upon hours under the glaring sun looking for a little, pottery shard with a little brush, okay? I mean, that's just grueling work that I myself would never expose myself to because, why? I am not interested personally in finding little shards of pottery. I'm interested in big walls, lost cities, adventure, stuff that that excites you. A little pottery shard, I could care less. While this work is that type of work is important, it's not the end-all and be-all of archaeology. And this is why archaeologists don't look at the stuff that we look at, because, look, I've talked to these people. After lectures, you always, or not always, but sometimes over beers, you meet at the hotel bar, and you have a beer, or you have two, or you have three, and the more beers you have, the more they speak the truth. And I have yet to meet one professor, one archaeologist who over a beer or over glasses of wine who has told me you are on the wrong track. That has not happened even once. Everyone said that, if I wouldn't be in this position as a university professor, I would side with you, but I can't. So it's necessity, because they have a family at home, kids to feed, but that is evidence enough that I need to know, hey, we're on the right track, and that's great.
Well, it's just sad that they can't.
Yes, because look, if you look at certain pieces of the stuff that we talk about, then there's only one conclusion. There is only one conclusion, that at some point in the remote past, extraterrestrials visited Earth and taught mankind various disciplines of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, and those disciplines, or that it happened like this, it's actually written down in the ancient traditions and the ancient legends and mythologies that is what happened. And here we are in modern times. The mainstream scientists only scoff at these stories, saying, oh, those are all just figments of our ancestors' imagination. It's all just, they were all just sitting around a campfire, getting drunk and smoking dope, and then they were conjuring up these stories. And I think that is an insult in the face of our ancestors, because we have to remember one thing, that when all those things these events were written down, writing was a fairly new invention. So I totally disagree that when you have this new type of technology, this new way of keeping something, written for posterity, that the first thing you write down is fantasy stories. They didn't.
That's a really good point.
Yes, what they wrote down was their history, or at least they wrote down what happened to their ancestors in order to preserve that knowledge. And here we are today saying, all that stuff is nothing else but fantasy. And it was not. Of course those stories are embellished. Of course stuff has been added to it. But every myth, every legend has a true core. And that's what Eric von Daniken and myself, that's what we're after. And we're trying to figure out, what really happened in the remote past.
So one of the questions that has come up, because we kind of talk about this, sitting around the coffee table and the dinner table, especially in relationship to Eric von Daniken's work, your work, is how much you guys agree or disagree or in alignment or confer with Zecharia Sitchin.
Oh, he's a dear colleague of ours. Zecharia, has submitted articles, and we've published articles of Zecharia in Legendary Times magazine. And Eric and Zach, they go back 30 years. He has spoken at Ancient Astronaut Society conferences, world conferences in New York and in Chicago, and I think a few times also somewhere in Europe when the conferences were held in Europe. But yeah, no, Zecharia is definitely, quote unquote, one of us. And I mean,
well,
look,
I kind of figured that.
Well, yes, and if there are quote unquote grand masters, then it would be Eric and Zechariah. I mean, without their work, we couldn't be doing what we're doing today. So they're definitely up there in the pantheon. Even though they don't like to hear that, but that's the truth.
Well, I agree with you. Totally agree with you. I mean, it was just kind of a question because you don't know, So anyway, so let's talk.
To briefly interject, I guess why you're asking this question leads me to think that what you're referring to is that in modern ufology, in the modern UFO field, there is all this bizarre and juvenile infighting. Everyone is fighting amongst themselves, and well, you're stupid because my theory is better, and I know better because I was abducted, and this and that, and I know exactly the name of the planet of where they came from, and so on and so forth. See, and in the ancient astronaut field, we don't do that because you know what? This field, both the ancient astronaut field and the modern UFO field, it's already so speculative to talk about what the name of the spaceship was, or what the name of the commander was, or what planet they came from. It's no wonder the modern UFO field has a bad reputation in the mainstream, because if you talk or discuss questions like that, I mean, that is just too much for the average person. Therefore, if you just talk about one question or the one idea that what if we're currently being visited by ETs, or what if we've been visited by aliens in the remote past, not answering the question where did they come from and what their name is or what the name of their spaceship was, people can handle that. But at the moment that you start going into details, that's when you lose the average Joe. And that is what we have to stop doing. And so we don't do that. We are asking the question, have we been visited? The answer is yes, and we put forth evidence. But we stay as far away from, adding more speculation or throwing more oil on the fire, because we already know that the topic we're dealing with is already so speculative. So let's keep it, let's keep speculation down to a minimum. So all the stuff we publish, by the way, we've all gone out in the field, we've photographed the items, we've measured them, we've touched them. So, it's not like we were sleeping in the middle of the night and then we received this information from a quote-unquote being from a higher plane. And stuff like that always happens in modern ufology. And I have my problems with that. Why do you have to add the speculation to a field that's already riddled with speculation?
Or add in all the channeled material. It's like, well, the council of this and these people said that, and it's like, okay, that's just a little too out there for me. It's like, can't we kind of keep it on this planet?
No, exactly. And the thing is, look, and here's the crazy thing, that of course I cannot disprove that these events or experiences that some people claim they have had, I cannot disprove that they didn't happen, because you just never know. But to report about this type of stuff in legendary times, to me, is anathema, because you'd alienate a whole bunch of more people, and that is exactly what the modern UFO field has to avoid. But it seems that no one's getting it. I mean,
well, at least you guys are keeping on track.
Well, yeah, but, you know, I mean, there's so many examples, but let's move on.
Okay. So let's talk about Eric's new book, History is Wrong. And so the book's title is History is Wrong, but how is history wrong?
Well, the title is essentially referring to that whatever history we're being taught in schools at the elementary level, but also in high school and in college and even in graduate school, that history is wrong because it doesn't address the right questions. Because in archaeology, you know, most every ancient monument is always ascribed to, well, this was built for the gods. This monument here was done, you know, to worship the gods. These rituals were performed for the gods. And then, case closed, mystery solved. All of this was done for the gods. And I am mystified how anyone can be satisfied with that answer, because what we're asking is, well, who the heck were these gods that the ancient texts are filled with? Who were these people? Where did they come from? Were they just, you know, invisible imaginations of our ancestors? Or did these gods really exist? And by the way, immediately at the outset of this interview, I would like to say that whenever I speak of gods, or Eric von Daniken and Zechariah Sitchin and David Childress, it's always lowercase g. It has absolutely nothing to do with God or the all-encompassing force of the universe. Those gods, according to the ancient astronaut theory, the definition of the ancient astronaut theory, those gods were flesh and blood extraterrestrials who arrived on Earth in nuts and bolts spaceships, and our ancestors, while they were highly intelligent, they were not dumb people, our ancestors, they were not savages, but our ancestors didn't understand, because their technological frame of reference was different than the frame of reference we have today. They didn't understand the nuts and bolts aspects behind those flesh and blood beings, and so they misinterpreted those beings for being divine and magical or supernatural, and that's why we have the gods. But they had absolutely nothing to do with the divine in a quote-unquote modern sense. And it's basically one big mistake, essentially.
Which is kind of scary to think our whole history is based on a mistake.
Yeah, well, no, mistake was the wrong word. I'm sorry. Misunderstanding. Misunderstanding.
Right.
Because it was most certainly not a mistake. But it's a misunderstanding, and you know, just to get a few people riled up, we would not have modern-day religions if it hadn't been for those visits of extraterrestrials in the remote past.
Well, you know, and when you talk about that whole concept, it always brings up the images of the TV series Stargate. I mean, you know, not that they had the wormhole thing, but that Ra came down and interacted with the people, and they saw him as a god, but he was a Goa'uld. No god going on there.
Right, and of course, that movie, which is, by the way, Eric von Daniken consulted on Stargate, the movie, and him and Roland Emmerich are very good friends. And Roland Emmerich made that movie in honoring Eric because he grew up reading Eric's books in Germany. So, you know, and Ra in that movie was he knew what he was doing, and he knew how to manipulate the crowds. And so, you know, Stargate is one of the most awesome ancient astronaut movies ever made. The only thing that, you know, we sort of disagree with is that not all of these extraterrestrials were so full of wrath and malevolence. I mean, they were a lot of these visits were were benevolent, like an intergalactic Peace Corps, sort of, you know? I mean, it wasn't all bad. So, you know, the whole idea about that they enslaved us and they used us as an obedient workforce, yeah, you know, I have my doubts about that, because I don't think that if you and I were to travel to a distant planet and encountered some type of civilization there and we're technologically superior, that you and I would immediately turn them as our slaves. I don't think so. But we would teach them a few things. So, you know, have a positive impact on that society and not a negative one.
Interesting. I just think that actually we're going to hit a break here, so why don't we kind of set up for coming back from break. Why don't we go next into talking about how there has been documentation. You spoke a little bit earlier about myths and legends and stuff like that, talking about these people, these beings, and let's kind of go a little further in depth into that whole area. What do you think?
Absolutely, you got it.
Talking to Giorgio Tsoukalos from Legendary Times about ancient aliens and Eric von Däniken's new book, History is Wrong. So before the break, we discussed talking about mythology. And I want to start with this question, because written history didn't start till 3,500 years BCE, but when do you think the aliens, you know, the ancient aliens, actually came to the planet, and is that actually depicted in the writings that we have today?
Yes and no. Yes, because some of the earliest writing that we know of, according to the mainstream, is are the Sumerian cylinder rolls that we have in ancient Sumeria, and so in those Sumerian texts, we can read that a long, long time ago, or during the time of the Sumerians, these star people called the Anunnaki arrived on planet Earth. And Anunnaki, by the way, translated into English, means those who from the heavens came. And it's very interesting that the Sumerians are also, according to the mainstream society, or the mainstream archaeologists, are also the first, quote-unquote, advanced society that ever lived, that, you know, built aqueducts and had a sewage system in their cities and had paved roads and things like this, or actually not paved roads, but with cobblestones. And so the texts are also very, very specific in saying that none of this would have been possible if the gods hadn't descended and taught us how to do this. So they're very adamant and very specific and telling in their role in their cylinder seals that none of this would have been possible without the Anunnaki. And here we are, well, not us, but, you know, mainstream archaeology saying, you know, they just, this is just hearsay and blah, blah. And that's not really the case. Now, is there evidence for an earlier visitation? Absolutely yes, because one of the basic tenets of the ancient astronaut theory is that, you see, if you read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin himself, at the end of that book, in the last chapter, admits, by the way, he says, look, I'm very fond of my theory. I think it makes great sense, but there is one thing, one nut, that I myself can't even crack, and this is that something happened in our genetic makeup a long, long time ago, because not everything can be explained away with coincidence or chance. So therefore today we have this infamous missing link. And so the ancient astronaut theory basically suggests that a long, long time ago, there was a specific targeted mutation of our DNA that ultimately, turned us into intelligent man. And anyone that follows genetics or follows anthropology would have to agree that at one point in our developmental history, a quantum leap happened where we essentially went from being inside the caves munching on bananas to literally building pyramids. And all of that happened in a very short amount of time compared to for however long we've actually been around as a species. And we've also gone through all these biological bottlenecks, and some anthropologists have suggested that at one point there were only 2 Homo sapiens left over, but they still were able to go through that bottleneck. So we're suggesting that all throughout our developmental history, we were aided along by extraterrestrials, and that possibly Earth is nothing else but one big gigantic laboratory, or that, scientists, sociologists especially, have come up with this zoo hypothesis that planet Earth is nothing but an intergalactic zoo, just like you and I would go to SeaWorld or to the San Diego Zoo or something like this. They would come here to planet Earth. And that's not me suggesting this. I mean, this is, these are people of sound mind at universities coming up with these theories, and they're highly fascinating futurologists who talk about this stuff. And so this other guy by the name of Michael Cremo, I'm sure you've heard of him. He wrote
I've
this
had him
book.
on the show.
There you go. He's a dear, dear colleague of mine. He appeared with me on the Ancient Aliens program a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And he suggests that not only have we been visited by extraterrestrials, but that mankind, or our human antiquity, doesn't go back 400,000 years, but he suggests hundreds of millions, tens of millions of years. And, he has evidence for that. These little iron spheres, perfectly round iron spheres that were found at levels that suggest, at strata levels that suggest that, this thing was created millions of years ago. And by the way, a normal sphere, that wouldn't be so riveting, but each of these spheres has like these perfect grooves around them, and some spheres have like 3 grooves, parallel grooves around it. I mean, it's quite interesting, and from the Hindu perspective that Michael Cremo subscribed to, Brahman, or the universe, the universe never began and it never will end. So the Big Bang Theory is right out the window. And personally, I also have my difficulties in accepting the Big Bang Theory, because the Big Bang Theory essentially suggests that all of this was created out of nothing. And that's really not possible, because when you have nothing, you can't add anything, because where did the something come from? So the Hindu beliefs suggest that Brahman, or the universe, just always existed. And so that would then, be, that would lend to the possibility that Earth is indeed, that 10 million years ago, there were other people living here on Earth. So,
they have a hard enough time going back 7,000 years, much less 10 million years.
Yeah, and personally, I try not to think about it, because your head just explodes. It really, it's so far back in deep antiquity that it's just really wild stuff to think about. It really is.
Well, I'm going to tell you, it's the Zapati footprint. Are you familiar? I think that's the name of it.
Oh, sure.
Are you familiar of the footprint in the rock?
Well, yes, absolutely.
From New Mexico. I'm still here. You still there?
Oh, okay, yes. Yeah, no, because for a second there I lost you.
But, I mean, are you familiar with that footprint?
Oh, of course. And then, there are these...
Well, I mean, I just want to share that I've actually seen it, and it's a footprint. I mean, It's not any carving. It's a footprint.
Yeah.
And so, and it's in a rock.
Yeah, and there are other examples like that. I mean, there is a footprint of a sandal, for example, that has been found. That's millions of years old, and it's as if Neil Armstrong's footprint on the moon will be found 1 million years from now on the moon, and people will be like, "Whoa, what the heck is this?" I mean, and this is what that sandal footprint almost looks like, and then. We have the Paluxy Man River controversy, where there's a footprint inside a footprint of a dinosaur, suggesting that who knows if dinosaurs lived when people lived. And I don't want to give any credence to creationists or anything like this. But Michael Cremo explains it away that, yes, people did exist with dinosaurs, but that was 65 million years ago. So before I give creationists any credit, I'd rather give Michael Cremo a credit and listen to his theory before I side with people who say all of this here was created 6,000 years ago, which I just shake my head. Because we've got science and then we've got fantasy. And the creationist stuff, I'm sorry if I'm stepping on anyone's toes here, but it's pure fantasy, and it just gets me riled up that, in the face of hard science, to say, oh, no, it was all God's will, so, God supersedes science. Well, I don't think so. But we also have the iron, we also have the fossilized hammer, where we have this almost perfectly preserved hammer of fossilized wood and iron, and we've actually reported about this in Legendary Times magazine not too long ago, where the people who are in possession of that hammer, the museum somewhere in Texas, they actually did some tests on that iron ore, the hammerhead, and the results they got back were absolutely spectacular, because essentially the iron ore that is millions of years old, we could not today, without technology, create something as pure as that hammerhead that's millions of years old. I mean, that's sensational, and nobody talks about it.
But why? I mean, unless you read alternative books like Michael's books, like Zachariah's books, like Eric's books, why? I mean, I remember reading Michael's book cover to cover and going, oh my God, you think you're contemporary on what's going on, and you read something like that, and how do you sit there and throw away something that looks like a spark plug that's buried, in a mine shaft somewhere, and go, oh, well, it's nothing. I mean, it should be on the front page of the newspaper.
Of course it should. That's exactly it. But, but we're the crazies, right? We're the ones that are kooky. It makes no sense. Well, it's because, look, I don't even know how to answer that question, because, you're absolutely right. But look, I think that, we truly are in the throes of some paradigm shift that's happening right now. Because, imagine it, radio shows such as yours and similar radio shows 20 years ago, you'd be very hard-pressed to even do something like this, not only just because of the technology, but also even less people were interested. But now, you know, I find it very difficult to find even one person who says, after I tell them what I do for a living, well, that's really stupid, I don't think so. Everyone says, wow, that's really cool. And then they say, that stuff you do, that really exists? I had no idea. I thought that stuff only happens in the movies, like Indiana Jones. I'm like, no, this whole thing is based in reality. So people are just not exposed to this. And once they're exposed, though, I think that just like when you read Chariots of the Gods, or when I heard about these things, that, you know, then all of a sudden you've got the ancient aliens bug, or whatever you want to call it, and it's irretrievable.
Let's kind of get back to where we kind of went off on this whole tangent. Talking about the scriptures and stuff, I mean, I think there has been a lot of talk about aliens in the Bible. I mean, there's been some TV shows about that. But are there other documents, other cultures that actually talk about, you know, what would be perceived of as being aliens, or documented people coming from the sky or something like that?
Oh yeah, and the Bible, while it is a great component of the ancient astronaut theory, and by the way, only the Old Testament, not the New Testament, and we can talk about that later. But to answer your question, I mean, virtually all of the ancient holy books or holy texts do describe encounters with extraterrestrial life forms. For example, the ancient epics of India, for example, the holy books, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Rig Vedas, the Upanishads, all those books, and anyone can go read this. I mean, you can go to any bookstore and buy a copy, or go to the library and rent a copy of the Mahabharata, and that book reads like Star Wars. It's like a modern-day science fiction novel where you have these beings, these gods that arrive from the depths of space in these giant spaceships, and there's these 3 cities orbiting the Earth, and from those cities the gods descended to Earth to interact with mankind in smaller flying machines called vimanas. And in those books you have minute descriptions what these vimanas looked like, what they were capable of, what their weaponry was. At one point, you know, it says, by the way, one such book that describes the vimanas in great detail is called the Vimanika Shastra, and it's a book from the 1600s that's based on even earlier texts that was just compiled. So this is not something that, you know, someone came up with 2 years ago. This is ancient stuff. And it describes that some of these vimanas were capable of being in 2 positions in the sky all at the same time, that they were extremely fast, and that one of them was able to become invisible, and one was faster than any arrow, and one was able to completely go up in smoke, and all just crazy stuff that you would read in a science fiction novel. And by the way,
but they lived in mud houses too.
Who lived in mud houses?
The people that wrote these things, it's like they lived in little mud houses, they were agricultural, but they had great imaginations. In ancient India, most people, well, yes, you are correct in that, but those stories were not written down by peasants. Those were written down by the rishis, which are, according to their traditions, direct descendants of those gods. And, you know, the whole idea of imagination, look, the saying that, you know,
that this was part of an imagination or fantasy, you'd be hard-pressed, if not impossible, to solve an algebraic equation without knowing the basics of mathematics. So, all these ancient stories that describe flying machines, gods descending from the sky, whenever people suggest that, this was just a thing of the imagination, then I would have to say, and not me, but psychologists have said this, that essentially you can't come up with a story unless there was an initial spark of inspiration, and you go from there. So that initial spark of inspiration is that our ancestors did see something, did see these battles in the sky that took place that are described in the Mahabharata, for example, where these three cities then all went to war with one another, orbiting cities went to war with one another, and they essentially shot themselves out of the sky, and everything fell in a gigantic fireball. In gigantic fireballs, it all fell down to earth, and this was all witnessed by thousands of people. So we have all these different stories describing the same stuff. And, in a court of law, circumstantial evidence is evidence, and you can win a case just by circumstantial evidence. So this is what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with proof by indication and circumstantial evidence. No one has ever found a spaceship. No one's ever found a ray gun or anything like this. But we're going by indications.
So I have a question. So with texts like the Mahabharata, are there any parallels or similarities between the stories and the history that came down through the Sumerian text, where you could say, okay, there was this story going on here with these characters, and actually there's a parallel kind of story, where the names have been changed, but the action is pretty similar between the two cultures?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I can go two ways with this, but I'm going to tell you one thing first and then maybe go into the second one later. But you see, all cultures have a creation story, whether it be ancient India or whether it be ancient Sumeria, Egypt, or Africa or South America, cultures, the Incas. It doesn't matter. Even Native American myths or the original creation story of Native Americans, all creation stories are exactly the same. Give or take, of course, but overall, they're exactly identical. And the thing is that they all essentially begin that it all started in the big, cold darkness. Now, big cold darkness, what does that mean? Could it mean that they meant space, deep space, and out of that deep cold darkness, a silver cosmic egg arrived near or on planet Earth, and from that silver, shiny cosmic egg, a heavenly ladder was lowered onto planet Earth, out of which these star people or these gods or the shining ones descended and essentially then, quote-unquote, jump-started life or, culture here on planet Earth. Now, was it really a silver egg? I don't think so. Again, our ancestors didn't have the same technological frame of reference that we have here, that we have today. So whatever they saw, or whatever they were told this thing was, okay, so it must have been a silver cosmic egg. But in reality, it was some type of a nuts and bolts spaceship that was misinterpreted as being divine in nature. Because, again, our ancestors weren't stupid. They knew that this thing was not an egg because they also added the word silver to it, and our ancestors knew there is no such thing as a silver egg, but those were the best words with which to describe what they saw. So, they had to work with the words that were available to them. So, yeah,
So when you go and I'm not sure if you're familiar with like the Aboriginal creation myth. I mean, because, it's theorized that they actually went to Australia like 50,000 years ago. And so if you're going to look for a really old tradition to start comparing to, I would think they would be a good shot because they were isolated.
And they are, because there are entire murals in Australia that were drawn, petroglyphs by the Aboriginals, and they all show these, space astronaut type looking beings, and their traditions are very clear in saying that they too have been visited by these quote-unquote spirit beings. Now, again, were they spirit beings? No, they were misinterpreted flesh and blood beings that they thought were spirits because, look, Arthur C. Clarke sums up, with his most famous quote, sums up the ancient astronaut theory perfectly. Arthur C. Clarke once said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And that's the ancient astronaut theory. Right there.
Right there. Like, period. End of show. Good interview.
No. But the thing is that, to return whether or not there are any parallels. For example, one of the questions I'm always asked is, well, then, are you people, the ancient astronaut people, you're the ones that say that the aliens built the pyramids, right? And the answer is absolutely not. Of course human beings built the pyramids. It wasn't aliens who built the pyramids, because the ancient Egyptian texts are very specific in telling us that King Zaurit and his people built the pyramids with the assistance of the gods, the guardians of the sky, or the teachers from heaven, which were those extraterrestrials. And the Egyptian texts are also very specific in saying that Zaurit is the same guy the Hebrew community calls Enoch. And when we come back from the break, we can definitely talk about Enoch as well.
Yeah, I like Enoch. He's a good guy. So, Giorgio, before the break, we were going to talk about Enoch. Now, isn't Enoch a character from the Old Testament, like from Genesis?
Yes, he is, and there is what's called the Book of Enoch, which a long time ago was an integral part of the Old Testament. However, that book then was taken out at the Council of Nicaea. And why? Because the book was considered to contain too much information, and it was too dangerous for the people to read about it. So it was taken out, and luckily it did survive as part of what today is known as the apocryphal texts, or the secret books of the Bible, which, by the way, all used to be a part of the Bible, but they were, like I said, they were taken out at the Council of Nicaea. Now, why was Enoch taken out, or the Book of Enoch taken out? Well, because Enoch essentially describes personal encounters with extraterrestrials, because, number one, it is an eyewitness report. It's I, Enoch, went there, and I saw, and I did, and then this happened to me, and so on and so forth. It's not something that somebody else described in the third person. But he essentially describes this visit, and many of today's theologians obviously are not referring to this as a visit, but as a vision, because, God forbid, this could have never happened in a physical reality, but only in the poor man's head, because he was obviously delusional by, conjuring up all these fantasy stories. But he essentially described a physical visit where he went up to, quote-unquote, heaven to meet the highest of the high, and he was taken up in what is described as the glory of the Lord, which was another way of saying some type of vehicle, because that glory of the Lord also, by the way, appears in the book of Ezekiel, which still today is actually a part of the Bible. They didn't take out Ezekiel, but they took out Enoch. And Enoch describes the exact same craft in the book of Ezekiel, and then he also describes the building in which that glory of the Lord landed in the second book or the second part of Ezekiel. And so Enoch is flown up there, and he describes his flight, that he's getting nauseous, and he doesn't like it. He feels very confined, and he's surrounded by these people, by these quote-unquote otherworldly beings, angels he calls them. But he also is very specific in saying that, while they all essentially look like me, they speak a language that I've never heard, and they're touching all these different jewels, and it's all very bright and white, and the light is blinding. And then they arrive at the house of the highest. And this house, he describes it as this palace filled with jewels and just lights, and even more, quote-unquote, angels that wear these bizarre clothes. And so he is brought to the highest of the highest, and of course the first thing the highest says to him, "Do not fear me, my earthling, and have no fear." And of course, Ezekiel falls to his knees. Enoch falls to his knees, and and the highest, quote unquote, God says, "No, come on, get up. Don't worry about it. I would like to introduce you to some of my colleagues here, and they're all going to teach you a few things that you should know about." So he introduces Enoch to some of these quote unquote angels, and one angel teaches Enoch in mathematics. One angel teaches Enoch in astronomy, and so on and so forth. So they're all teachers, and he is basically giving this fast writing tool that he essentially put pen to paper, and all this stuff all of a sudden was written on that piece of paper without him essentially doing anything. So again, what is described here? Is it some type of technology? What is a fast writing tool? We don't know. So what we have here is, in essence, all those jewels and the bright light and these different things that he sees. If you walk into a flight deck of an airplane or some command center, and if you don't have the words to say, look, these are little lights, these are all control lights to guide the plane with, well, what's the next thing you're going to say? It looks like a bunch of jewels. So of course he had to say they're jewels or gems, because he didn't have the words, the technological words needed to describe or to say exactly what it is that he saw. So he used the words to the best of his capabilities that he had at his disposal.
And so what did he do with all that? Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah. Oh, and by the way, Enoch is the first person in the Bible that actually didn't die on planet Earth, but before his death, he was taken up in a chariot of fire. And so, what did he do with those books? And thank you for reminding me about that. So earlier, I said that the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptian texts, the Al-Hittat, in there it says that Zaurit and his people built the pyramids, and in there it also is described why the pyramids, or at least the Great Pyramid, was built, for what purpose. And that is because Zaurit and his people were also visited by these extraterrestrials, and Zaurit is the only one who had direct contact with these extraterrestrials, with these guardians of the sky. And they, too, taught him how to write, taught him in mathematics and all these different academic disciplines, and they also dictated to him all these books containing the quote-unquote knowledge of the universe. And so this was a very long project that took place over the months. And then upon completion, he went, at one day he went to those Guardians of the Sky, and they were all very solemn and very sad. And he's like, "What's up? What's going on? Why are you so sad?" And the Guardians of the Sky basically told him, "Well, don't know how to tell you this, but there will be this huge flood, natural catastrophe, that will essentially wipe out every living being in this part of the world." And so Zaurit went back to his people, and he conferred with them, told them what was about to happen, and they decided that, this knowledge, these books that have been bestowed upon their culture from those gods, that those need to be saved. And so Zaurit went back to the gods, and he said, "Look, we understand what's going to happen, but at least can we save this knowledge so that whoever survives, that they don't have to start from scratch." So the extraterrestrials were very pleased with that request, and then it says, and Zaurit and his people built the pyramids with the assistance of the Guardians of the Sky. So apparently, somewhere on that Giza plateau are those books. Maybe they've been discovered. Who knows? There's this talk about a potential Hall of Records that has always been rumored about. And again, so the text is also very clear in saying that Zaurit and Enoch are the one and the same person. So there the story is corroborated. And also Zaurit, by the way, at the end of the Al-Hittat story, is also taken up in some type of a craft.
Now, I have never heard of that character. And so what text or what site did that information come from?
That is the Al-Hittat, A-L, and then apostrophe, no, not apostrophe, hyphen, H-I-T-A-T, and that is an ancient, well, not ancient, Egyptian text from about 1,500 years ago, and it is a very and it's a not very well-known text. It's an unknown text because it doesn't fit into the mainstream chronology of who or why the pyramids were built. I mean, still today we're told on the Discovery Channel that the pyramids were tombs. That's simply incorrect. It's incorrect.
What about the idea that they were residence chambers or that they were power plants? I mean, I've heard all kinds of stuff about what they actually were.
No, sure. Look, the thing is that, obviously, the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, wasn't just built for those 300 books, because you don't need a gigantic construction like that for a couple of pieces of paper. So obviously that monument was built as a message for future generations that would, anyone with a half a brain would have to look at that and be like, wow, what? This was done with wooden rollers and with pulleys? I don't think so. And again, I'm not saying that the ancient Egyptians did not build the pyramids, because they absolutely did. But they had help. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with help, because we today, I have structural engineers who have gone forward in the pages of legendary times, who have gone forward and gone on record, who have come forward and gone on record of saying that we today could not reproduce the Great Pyramid. Now, what more do you need? It's like, and of course, then you have the wise professors who are saying, well, of course we could do it. Yet the structural engineer who does, building, construction, that's his or her line of work, they're saying we can't do it. And the professor, but of course we can do it. It's no problem. So who do you believe, the professor or the guy in the field? I always go with the guy in the field.
Well, but especially we were living in our little mud huts, and kind of throwing seeds out there and hoping they were going to grow. But we built that thing on the side, as our part-time job.
Oh, and
all right. I have a burning question for you. Because they say it was a tomb, and in all the other tombs, there, is the belief there was the carvings, and there's the assumption that there were grave goods. And so when when they started to explore the pyramid, basically the way that they got into the pyramid was that they drilled holes in it and blew up parts of it to get in till they finally got to the king's chamber. And so, or not the king's chamber, the grand galley or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, if there were tomb robbers that stole all this stuff, wouldn't there have been a hole getting into the pyramid somewhere first?
Well, Al-Mamun is the guy that he was the first quote-unquote tomb raider of the pyramid. That is, of the known record. And his entrance is actually still the entrance that's being used today if you go there as a tourist. This is why the first few feet of entering the pyramid, you go through this, basically this hole that has sort of been chiseled crudely into the pyramid. But you see, here's the difference, because you were referring to hieroglyphics and them possibly being tombs. And I know you don't subscribe to that idea, of course. But all tombs, all temples, all underground facilities, all types of monuments that you find in Upper and Lower Egypt or throughout Egypt, doesn't matter where you go, the walls are filled with hieroglyphics of who built it, when it was built, how many people were a part of this, what it was for, this and that. All very elaborate, and in some occasions you even have hieroglyphics on the ceilings, because they almost didn't have enough space to cram all this information onto the walls. And guess what? You walk inside the Great Pyramid, including the two pyramids standing or flanking the Great Pyramid, and all the walls are blank. There's not one single hieroglyphic in there, and the only hieroglyphic or the only cartouche that was ever found in there, which led to the whole, quagmire or fiasco that allegedly Cheops or Khufu built the Great Pyramid, was found in the relieving chamber above the the king's chamber. It was found in the relieving chamber above the king's chamber. They found this cartouche, and that cartouche spelled the name of Cheops. Problem is that that's a forgery, because that cartouche contains a spelling error, and the spelling error was identical with the journals of the person who actually, painted that cartouche in the middle of the night because he didn't want to embarrass himself in front of the world press when he wanted to announce who built the pyramid. And I think it was, I don't think that it was Auguste Mariette who did that. The name escapes me of that person. It might also be some Frenchman it was. But I forgot his name right now. The name escapes me. But it's a forgery. And even though it's been proven, people still subscribe to the idea that
they still show it on TV. You have Zahi climbing up there going, here, look, here's this graffiti. Yeah.
Yeah, and that graffiti, and it's totally, it's a hypocrisy in the entire Egyptian culture that every single monument that you can visit in Egypt is filled with hieroglyphics, and the Great Pyramid is anonymous. I mean, and also the idea that you know the pyramids are much younger than the unfinished pyramids that can be found in the vicinity. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. And luckily, you know, the thing is that you really can't date stone. So, you know, this will be a debate that we'll have 500 years down the road, unless, of course, the ancient astronauts will come back and say, hey, by the way, we were here 5,000 years ago.
But the work that they've been doing around the Sphinx with the water erosion and stuff like that, I think that really holds validity, because if you sit there and talk about how long ago it's been when that area was tropical and would be exposed to water, we're talking 7,000 BC and further back, which blows the whole timeline right there.
Of course, but Zahi Hawass would look you in the eye and say that Dr. Schock and John Anthony West's work is invalid. So what do you say? How do you reply to that? I mean, the evidence is in front of your eyes, and you'd be told, no, it is wrong. So what are you going to do? See, it is absolutely flabbergasting. It's flabbergasting because the evidence, it's physical evidence. It's not even theoretical anymore. It's physical. It's right there. The water lines can be seen. So
do you think they found the chamber under the Sphinx paw, and do you think they're just covering it up?
Of course.
You know, the one that Edgar Casey talked about, and it's like, nah, it's just a little box.
Well, look about. I mean, check this out. Many moons ago, gosh, well, almost 8 years ago, we published a story about an alleged underground tunnel system underneath the Giza Plateau, an extensive system of shafts and corridors connecting all the pyramids and the Sphinx and other chambers, and just crazy stuff. Well, anyone who has been following the news, that exact system was released on CNN. The existence of that thing was released on the ordinary news, CNN, 6 weeks ago. And we reported about this in Legendary Times 8 years ago, and Eric wrote about it 20 years ago in one of his books. So, I mean, you know, and they're making this out to be this amazing, spectacular discovery, when, you know, to us it was like, yeah, what else is new? Glad you're joining the bandwagon here.
Yeah, you see, there's our graffiti from 8 years ago. Hey, we have a question from the chat room from UFO UK. The question is, what will it take for them to believe?
Wow. Wow. Well, you see, gosh, well, actually, the question is, who is the question addressed to? Because, you know, I would say that, you know, normal people out there like you and me, if we look at this stuff and, you know, seeing this, it makes sense. So I guess the question from UFO UK is whether the critics what would it take for them. And for the critics, you know what, or at least the debunkers, all hope is lost with them, because they've made it their life's mission, despite whether or not they would agree with all this information. They're hell-bent on dismantling our theory. But here's a very interesting thing. Have you ever noticed how it has actually happened where debunkers have joined the alternative history field, but never, or at least in my memory or in my experience, I've never seen someone who is subscribing to our ideas flip over to the debunker's side? Why? You see,
never.
Yeah.
Because it becomes so limited and finite, and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. No, I think I don't like to make predictions, but the one prediction that I've been making lately is that if you look at a textbook that was used at universities from about 200 years ago, or even from 100 years ago, 90% or even 95% of the knowledge that was considered cutting edge in that particular book and time period today is obsolete. So, 100 years down the road, all this cutting edge knowledge that's in our textbooks today, 95% will be obsolete as well. One of the few theories and ideas that will still be valid 100 years from now, or even 500 years down the road, will be the ancient astronaut theory. And unfortunately, we won't live that long, but I absolutely think that will be the case, that the ancient astronaut theory will be one of the few theories that will actually become valid in the next few years and then retain its validity until, at least 500 years from now.
I think the only field that they actually fess up that, oh, well, maybe that's not right, has been in dinosaur work. There's the new controversy about the comet that landed in the Yucatan that wiped out the dinosaurs, and they're saying, well, that really wasn't the case. And, it's not being suppressed. I mean, they're letting that go out, and, and that was a kind of new theory, too. And so that's really the only area, of science where we want to learn new stuff that seems like they change their mind. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And another thing is also, that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when you talked to astrophysicists, no one said or ventured forward to say that, extraterrestrial life might exist. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find any scientist who says extraterrestrial life does not exist. Of course it does. But the difference today is also that they'll say, while extraterrestrial life exists, there is no way that life could have ever come here. And 40 years from now, that will be different also, because then the mainstream will agree with us. It's a matter of time.
Well, isn't it, the running commentary that, all the old-timers have to die off so that, the theories of the young can move into prominence?
I never wish anyone to go on to the next world, but yes, but that's happened throughout history. That was always the way how it works. Yes.
I mean, but that's just sad. I mean, I had this conversation, I can't remember with who. It's like, these are scientists, these are historians, they're archaeologists. They spend their lives trying to find out the truth, only to not tell anybody.
Right. Because here's another fascinating story, a quick one before we go to break, I guess. Some archaeologists who have who have retired, actually have called Eric von Daniken, and some of them have called me, saying, I've been a huge fan of you guys' work all throughout my career, And would it be okay if I could write a book about my findings? And of course it is. So there are now some old retired archaeologists, some pretty high people up there who are in the process of releasing some of their information.
Great. So when we come back, maybe we can talk about things like Nazca and Tiwanaku and some of the sites that you've been to. Okay?
You got it.
Have been all over the planet to, I don't even know how many different sites, and I totally envy you for that. But one of the things that, that Ancient Aliens show that was on TV, we saw that show, and there was something in that show that two things. One was about Nazca. One of the comments that was made during that show was that the mountain heads had been sheared off to put the lines there. So for anyone who's not familiar with Nazca, can you kind of give them a little intro to it and then talk about some of that other stuff?
Sure, absolutely. So Nazca is located in Peru, and it's a few hundred miles south of Peru's capital, Lima. And it's this desert plain, and as you go there, you really, if you stand on the ground, you really can't see or discern much. But anyone visiting Nazca should go ahead and rent a little propeller plane, and they have like a half hour or an hour flights for $180 to $300 an hour to fly across the plain of Nazca. And as you take off with that plane, an entire picture book unfolds underneath your eyes, and it's just this very spectacular place where you have these geoglyphs that have been etched into the ground. And most famously, you have these gigantic drawings of a spider, a monkey, a whale, a hummingbird, and some beings that have these bizarre halos around their heads, and also antennae on the heads. And this one creature looks like E.T., really, and one hand is pointing down to Earth, and the other hand is pointing up to the sky. So very interesting occurrence right there. But the geoglyphs of the spider and of all those animal shapes, it's not really what interests us. What interests us is the rest of Nazca, and in addition to those shapes, you also have these very, very long straight lines that go. One of the longest is 20 miles. I mean, just goes straight over mountains, over valleys, up and down, but just straight as an arrow. And you have many, many, many of these lines going in all sorts of different directions. And at the same time, then in addition to those thin lines, we also have these wider bands. And those bands, those wider lines, seen from the air, they truly look like airstrips, landing strips, but they never were landing strips. That's another thing that debunkers are saying, that, oh yeah, so you're saying that Nazca was an ET airport, right? No, that is not the case. And the most spectacular thing at Nazca is what you've just mentioned, that there is this mountaintop that is essentially missing, where an entire mountaintop has essentially been sheared off, as if cut off with a cheese knife, and it's been flattened so it now looks like a table almost, or it's as flat as a tabletop, and the mountains around it still have the summits, the summits that are intact. They're still converging at the top. So how was this done, number one? Because nowhere in the vicinity do you find the rubble of that mountaintop. And, of course, on that mountaintop, on that flattened mountaintop, you have some bands, some lines that look like airstrips. And what's also very interesting is that some of the lines are older than some other lines, because in some examples you can see how some lines go underneath other lines. So which means that one line was laid down before the other line was laid on top. How it was done, I have absolutely no idea, and anyone who claims to know the answer, run for the door, because they don't know the answer. Because one idea that has been proposed is that, you can just walk out on the plain and with your foot you scratch off the surface, you scratch the pebbles, and then a darker or a lighter shade of stone will appear underneath it. Well, number one, that is impossible, and number two, the next time, it's a desert plain, so there's a lot of wind and storms going on out there, or strong winds at least, so that these little pebbles, it would just, put everything back in place, and those lines would disappear again. And now these lines have been there for thousands of years. So it's still a big mystery. And again, anyone who tells you that there are no mysteries at Nazca, run for the door. They don't know what they're talking about.
Well, didn't they do some testing, like checking for background radiation in certain areas versus, the ambient radiation to see if something happened there?
And I'm glad you've mentioned that, because that is actually described in the last chapter of History is Wrong. And in fact, the outfit who conducted these experiments was the Erich von Däniken Foundation. And so, absolutely, because anywhere you go, you have certain levels of background radiation. You have certain levels of electromagnetism, and you have certain levels of arsenic and things like that. Well, at Nazca, all those normal levels, especially at the beginning and at the end of each of these lines, or these wider bands, those things that look like airstrips, those levels are off the charts. Off the charts. And I don't mean by, maybe 2 to 3 times. No, thousands of times. So why? So something happened at Nazca, and something is not right at Nazca right now. Absolutely.
So are mainstream sciencey people looking at the results of the study, or are they going, it's all faked? Because that's hardcore, that's paper,
Yeah. I am sure that, or not I'm sure, but I know that mainstream scientists did look at the results, because the only way that we were allowed to conduct these types of measurements and to actually, because, you can't walk on the Nazca Plain. It's a World Heritage Site, and the only people that are allowed to walk out there are, university scientists. So we had to align ourselves with the University of Leipzig, with the archaeology department there. So we actually worked together with a real university, Leipzig University, world famous, and they, on behalf of us, conducted all these studies. And of course, Erich von Däniken was there while all this took place, this and that. And so it's not like, they didn't tell anyone who they were doing this for. But the questions that we asked were different than what, for example, an archaeologist would ask, a mainstream archaeologist would ask once he or she would stand on the Nazca Plain. You see, a mainstream archaeologist is only interested in little pottery shards, as I said at the beginning of this interview, and that's it. But we went in there with a completely different mindset. We said, screw the pottery shards. Let's look at background radiation. Let's look at arsenic levels. Let's look at all these different chemical compositions. Let's find out how these lines were even created. And so yes, the paper did make the rounds in scientific circles, but did anyone do anything with it? No. We were the only ones that published it in Legendary Times magazine, and Eric elaborated a little bit more about it in History is Wrong. But that's about it. And that just gives you the dire position or poor state our mainstream archaeology is in. That, here you have what you just said, hard evidence, and it's being ignored. I mean, is that science? I don't think so. That is not science anymore.
I don't think so either.
That's ignorance. And because science should be the search for truth. And if you ignore, pieces of evidence that obviously step on your toes, well, then you're no longer a scientist, but you're a dogmatist, and you're preserving your carefully cobbled together dogma and chronology.
You're covering the pension. So we have 15 minutes left, and I want to spend the last 5 minutes maybe talking about Legendary Times. So let me ask you this. So of all the places that you've been to in the world, what has been your favorite or the most exciting site that you've been to?
Well, that is hands down the Puma Punku in the highland of the Andes in Bolivia, right next to Lake Titicaca, which is the highest navigable lake in the world. And it's this little-known site that is right next to Tiwanaku. And every day you have hundreds and hundreds of tourists that arrive at Tiwanaku and take pictures of the Gate of the Moon and the Temple of the Sun and all those things. And then they trot back to the bus and they drive back to their hotel. While only 300 yards away from Tiwanaku is this place called Puma Punku. And what we find there is absolutely flabbergasting. It defies logic, because we have stone blocks there that are as big as railway cars, and they're all strewn about the fields. And at one point, all of these pieces fit together because you can see how, some stone cuttings were, that was the male part, and some stone cutting was the female part. So at one point, they were all combined together. And we have cuttings there and chiselings that are very technical looking in nature. So there is no weird, faces or carvings of people or anything like that. But it's a very anonymous site. But the carvings themselves, they are very technical, straight lines that have little holes in them every 3 or 4 centimeters, going down a block of granite, for example. Not for example, but all the stones at Puma Punku are granite and diorite, and on the Mohs scale of rock density, granite is a 7 and an 8, and the only stone that's harder is diamond. So the only way any of these cuts or these stone blocks could have been cut is if the tools that they used were tipped with diamonds. And according to mainstream archaeology, that's an impossibility. But it's a physical fact that is the only way how it could have been done. So, we have a contradiction there. And the local population who still lives there are the Aymara Indians, and when you ask the Aymara Indians, who built this? Because, I forgot to say, the mainstream archaeologists say that it was the Aymara Indians who built this. And when you ask the Aymara, well, was it you? They will look you in the eye and say, no, it wasn't us. And then you ask, well, then who was it if it wasn't you? They're like, well, it was the gods. And they point to the sky. And so here we have living mythology. We have people who are very proud of their traditions, of their history, and they maintain that not only has this place been around since before the beginning of time, but also it was built, quote-unquote, by the gods. So, and here we are, ignoring their history. And we would all have to agree, in order to build something as magnificent as Puma Punku, you would need, planning and logistics and trying to get, this piece goes here and this piece goes there. So for that, I think you would need paper or at least something to write on, or, not necessarily paper, but just a writing style. Well, the mainstream archaeologists agree also that the Aymara never had any writing. So they're contradicting themselves here, and they're not even seeing that they're contradicting themselves. And so we have a huge, huge mystery there, and Puma Punku by far is my number one, and anything else is a very, very distant second. How were these blocks transported? The mainstream suggestion is, easy, this was all done with wooden rollers. Well, what nobody tells you is that Puma Punku is situated at 14,000 feet, which is above the natural tree line. There are no trees there are no trees up there. It's too high. Trees. The next batch of trees is 1,000 miles away. So, did they cart thousands of tree trunks there to transport these stones from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away?
I don't think so.
Yeah, this was not done without sophisticated technology.
Well, even when you look at Tiwanaku and how they have the rocks that, it's got 15 different angles, and the rock next to it has 15 different angles, and you can't put a piece of paper between the rocks, and, either those people were really OC, or they had some help in figuring out how to make that happen. I mean, I was amazed when I saw the Tiwanaku when I was in school studying art history. I was just like, dang, how did they do that? And this site sounds even more impressive.
Oh, yeah, no, and the thing is that the place is also Sacsayhuaman next to Cusco. At Sacsayhuaman, there is this wall that is earthquake-proof, and, legend has it that at one point, by the way, all of this stuff is pre-Inca. It's pre-Inca. It's not Inca. And archaeologists agree with that. But when you ask the archaeologists, well, who was this pre-Inca civilization? Who were they? They'll say, oh, we don't really know. At least they admit to that, okay, which is great. So all this ancient, megalithic type building style that can be found in South America is all pre-Inca. So legend has it that the pre-Incas had some type of a way of softening stone. And so the idea is that, and of course I know that this sounds all very crazy, but I'm giddy about it because it's a fun story and an interesting story, that they were able to put this paste on the stone, and it made the rock soft and malleable, sort of like putty, and then they would put it in place, and then the stone would harden again. And the reason why that legend exists is because there is an actual bird in South America, especially in the regions of Peru and Ecuador, called the litlick bird. And that bird doesn't nest like a conventional bird by collecting little branches and putting them together in a little nest, but he goes out and he goes to some type of a plant, chews the leaves inside, or not chews, but just puts these leaves inside his beak, and then a chemical reaction takes place inside his beak, and the bird flies to a rock wall, and with his beak and some saliva at the tip of his beak, he starts picking on the rock, and the rock softens, and that bird is capable of softening the rock and making a groove, a round type of, looks like a nest out of that rock by getting this herb, and with the chemical reaction that takes place inside his beak. I mean, it's very fascinating. So who knows if this was implemented on a grander scale?
And that's possible. I mean, I don't think the bird can make straight lines.
No, it wasn't done by the...
I just am joking. So we're almost out of time. So let's talk about Legendary Times and some of the work that you're doing now, and if there's like any expeditions coming up, or if people want to subscribe to Legendary Times. What's that all about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're planning a member expedition possibly in the fall of 2010 to Easter Island or to India. That has not yet been determined. But, anyone who checks back frequently on legendarytimes.com definitely would read about it. So, but what I would like to do for the listeners of this program, if you go to legendarytimes.com and at the top yellow bar, click on free info, put in your information, and I'll send you a sample issue of Legendary Times, so you can check it out and see what it's all about. And we actually just published a Indiana Jones issue, and it's all about the mysteries that Indiana Jones pursued in the movies, like the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail and crystal skulls and stuff like this. So it's a very, very adventurous and good issue. So anyone who wants to have a look at that, just come on over and I'll send you a copy.
Great. But it's a magazine that you can subscribe to, I'm assuming.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I mean, the sample issue obviously is with the idea that you'll subscribe, because that's the only way that we can do the work that we do. And our work is membership supported, almost like NPR.
But it's commercial free.
Yes, exactly. That's why I said almost like NPR. So yes, we supersede NPR.
Well, and the reason why I brought that up is that there's so much material online, that people are like, oh, I can just sign up for a newsletter or something. But this is actually a real magazine that you get in the mail.
Yeah, it's a real magazine. You can settle, you can, read it in your favorite chair while drinking your favorite beverage, so you don't have to sit at the computer. And in that way, I'm very old school, where, I can't read this stuff online. It's just, and also we're very careful about, disseminating our information on the web. So none of the articles that are published in the pages of Legendary Times can be found online. And, of course, I'm jinxing it now. But, yes, so we're very careful that this stuff doesn't go out, and so that, you're actually getting your money's worth, that, the stuff that we publish you can't find for free on the Internet. And again, like I said, this is what, supports the cause. And our cause is to spread the idea of the ancient astronaut theory worldwide, and we do it by publishing the magazine. And of course, people like me publishing it, Zachariah Sitchin, David Childress, Eric von Daniken has an article in there almost every issue. So, you get stuff from the who's who in the ancient astronaut field.
And that's great.
Mm-hmm.
You are just so cool. I love you. I was writing in the chat room. It's like, hey, I could talk to this guy for hours. It's like, oh, wait, I am. I'm like, ooh, but it's only 2, and it's not enough time.
Well, let's do it again.
Let's do this again. Giorgio, thank you. You've been a dear.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you, Dr. Rita.
Bye. So that was Giorgio Tsoukalos from legendarytimes.com, and we were talking about Eric von Daniken's book, History is Wrong.
Hello and welcome to Forbidden History Radio, where we explore humanity's hidden history, out-of-place artifacts, lost civilizations, and startling evidence that the truth is being suppressed.
So again, today we're going to be talking about ancient aliens, and to do that, we'll be talking to Giorgio Tsoukalos. And so let me tell you a little bit about Giorgio, and we will get him on the air. Giorgio A. Tsoukalos has been described as a real-life Indiana Jones. As a trailblazer, he is changing the way the world thinks about ancient astronaut theory. For over 10 years, Giorgio has been the director of Eric von Daniken Center for Ancient Astronaut Research, which is AASRA, Archaeology, Astronautics, and SETI Research Association. Ooh, that's a mouthful. He is also the publisher of Legendary Times, the world's only and definitive ancient astronaut research journal. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio from legendarytimes.com, Giorgio Tsoukalos. Hey, Giorgio.
How are you, Dr. Rita? I'm really happy to be here. I'm sure we're going to have a great time.
I am just so excited about having you on. When I got notification that Eric von Daniken had a new book out, I was like, woohoo, woohoo, wait, pick me. And just having you on the show just makes my day. I'm just so excited to have you here. So let's start at the beginning. How, you are the director of Eric's organization. I put the paper down, and the print is so small. His Center for Ancient Astronaut Research.
Yeah.
How did you get involved with that and just into the whole ancient astronaut ball game?
Well, I really have to thank my parents for that, because growing up, we traveled the world quite extensively, and so my parents always made sure that whenever we were in different countries, we'd go to the museums and to the archaeological sites and have under a new banner, Legendary Times, and what was I supposed to say? No? So, of course, Of course I said yes, and here we are in our 11th year running Legendary Times, and our first issue had 12 pages, and now, 11 years later, now every issue has at least 64 pages.
Wow.
And
That's some pretty good growth.
Yeah, and we're completely ad-free, so, you know, the magazine is 64 pages of articles from the first to the last page. So it's not, you know, because with a lot of magazines in a similar or in the alternative history field, it's like you're looking at a pictorial for ads. And this is not the case with us. And we also use, you know, we don't use 16-point font. We use small font. So it's really it's jam-packed with information.
So I have to ask this question because, you know, my experience with Eric von Däniken is, you know, through his books and then seeing him on TV. So is he really like that? I think he's, you know, he comes off as being like a really cool and fun guy and somebody that I would love to sit down and drink a beer with. Is he that way in real life?
Yes, he is, absolutely. And he is one of the most, you know, down-to-earth people that you'd ever meet. Very generous with his time, very friendly, and you know, just, you know, because here's the crazy thing that sets essentially the Legendary Times organization apart, and Eric von Däniken apart from a whole bunch of the other people in the UFO field, and that is, you know, at heart, both Eric von Däniken and myself and David Childress and Jason Martell, Zechariah Sitchin, all of my colleagues, we're skeptics at heart because there are certain pieces of evidence that have been put forth that were just plain wrong. And if a piece of evidence turns out to be wrong or is wrong, our organization has no problem in throwing that piece of evidence out because, you know, people say, well, why would you do that? That just diminishes the whole theory. And you, as a educated woman, know that, look, anyone who's educated, or even anyone with a half a brain knows, the more false evidence not happened even once. Everyone said that, you know, if I wouldn't be in this position as a university professor, I would side with you, but I can't. So it's necessity, because they have a family at home, kids to feed, but that is evidence enough that I need to know, hey, we're on the right track. And that's great. You know, I mean...
Well, it's just sad that they can't.
Yes, because, look, if you look at certain pieces of the stuff that we talk about, then there's only one conclusion. There is only one conclusion, that at some point in the remote past, extraterrestrials visited Earth and taught mankind various disciplines of you know, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, and those disciplines, or that it happened like this, it's actually written down in the ancient traditions and the ancient legends and mythologies that is what happened. And here we are in modern times. The mainstream scientists only scoff at these stories, saying, oh, those are all just figments of our ancestors' imagination. It's all just, you know, they were all just sitting around a campfire, getting drunk and smoking dope, and then they were conjuring up these stories. And I think that is an insult in the face of our ancestors, because we have to remember one thing, that when all those things these events were written down, writing was a fairly new invention. So I totally disagree that when you have this new type of technology, this new way of keeping something, you know, written for posterity, that the first thing you write down is fantasy stories. I mean,
that's a really good point.
Yes, I mean, What they wrote down was their history, or at least they wrote down what happened to their ancestors in order to preserve that knowledge. And here we are today saying, oh, you know, all that stuff is nothing else but fantasy. And it was not. Of course those stories are embellished. Of course stuff has been added to it. But every myth, every legend has a true core. Once you eliminate from a theory, the stronger the theory gets, because whatever pieces of evidence are left over, gosh, that means your theory has just gotten stronger because you're eliminating the wrong stuff. And that's what we're doing. And whatever, you know, has remained makes the ancient astronaut theory even more, you know, Teflon, like Teflon.
Well, and I think it's interesting because I think that there's a lot of evidence, you know, and even from a conceptual point of view, back in the 70s, reading Chariots of the Gods, I mean, it totally made sense to me. You know, there's what the academicians say, but then there's, you know, what your head and your heart say that made sense. And I don't understand, with the amount of evidence and proof that has been coming forward over the years, why mainstream archaeology, I guess that would be the field, still has such heartburn with it.
Well, because, you know, the chronologies that they've established in their textbooks and in their museums and things like that. Look, the archaeologists are doing wonderful, wonderful work. They're a great bunch of people who take it upon themselves to spend hours upon hours under the glaring sun looking for a little, you know, pottery shard with a little brush, okay? I mean, that's just grueling work that I myself would never expose myself to because, you know, why? I am not interested personally in finding little shards of pottery. I'm interested in big walls, lost cities, you know, adventure, you know, stuff that that excites you. A little pottery shard, I could care less. You know, I mean, while this work is that type of work is important, it's not the end all and be all of archaeology. And this is why archaeologists don't look at the stuff that we look at, because, look, I've talked to these people. After lectures, you always, or not always, but sometimes over beers, you meet at the hotel bar, and you have a beer, or you have two, or you have three, and the more beers you have, the more they speak the truth. And I have yet to meet one professor, one archaeologist who over a beer or over glasses of wine who has told me you are on the wrong track, that has some, you know, guided tours, this and that. But then, you know, upon our return home, my grandmother would say, look, yes, you've just been to all these places, and you've been told this mainstream idea of this site or that site, but let me introduce you to some alternative history perspectives. And so it was also my grandmother who introduced me to the books of Eric von Daniken and all sorts of other ancient astronaut and alternative history researchers and writers. And so at an early age, the idea that there is an alternative perspective out there on history has been instilled upon me, you know, like I said, at a very, very early age. So this was sort of dinner table conversation, especially when my grandparents would be, you know, coming over for a visit. And so it also didn't hurt that I grew up for part of my life in Switzerland, and Eric von Daniken is Swiss. So as a young teenager, I started to go to some of his lectures, and I became friends with some of Eric's friends. And then one thing led to the other. I became friends with Eric. And then in college, that was in the mid-90s, Dr. Gene Phillips, the guy who ran the Ancient Astronaut Society, decided to finally retire and just enjoy his life in Florida. So Gene Phillips at that point published this magazine called Ancient Skies, and that had been around since 1974, and that was the English version that he published, and Eric von Daniken, since 1974, published a German version of Ancient Skies. So when Gene Phillips told Eric, I'm going to retire, Eric was like, all right, well, no problem, because I'm going to continue publishing Ancient Skies in German. We have no problem with that, or there won't be much of a difference. But what about the English-speaking world? So Eric essentially gave me a call, asked me if I wanted to, head a new organization